Teaching poetry is a huge pain in the neck. Partly because you have to make, or an instructor has to make the assumption that most of the students in the class are going to have no real functional knowledge of how poetry works, or even what poetry is. Go back and look at your definitions of poetry. Oh, by the way, before we get started, I wanted to let you guys know I entered some attendance data in. If you haven't been posting in the forum, yikes, it's going to be bad. You're going to be counted absent quite a lot. I'll try to warn you if I have to unenroll you from the course. But yeah, so watch out for that. Make sure you're participating in the discussions. I haven't responded to any in a while, but that's because I've been a bad teacher. Anyhow, you have to make, looking back at the way that you discuss poetry, anytime somebody tries to go in and define poetry, there's just a real bad scattershot. And a lot of you obviously don't feel bad if you did this. A lot of you guys probably went on Google and looked up the definition. There was a lot of just technical stuff. The definition of poetry is incredibly complex and a bit more than a bit unstable. Depending on your cultural background, depending on your values as a society, poetry can do some wild swerving, and it can produce all sorts of variations in length and in form. One thing that we're trekking through American literature, and in a lot of ways, we're seeing poetry that has been through a great deal of development. If you go back to the Middle Ages, and a little bit further, if you go to Shakespeare, the Elizabethan era, going up through Keats and other writers of a little bit earlier, poetry is mainly defined by its structure and by its rigorous form. The fact that you're supposed to rhyme in very particular ways, the A-B rhyme schemes of sonnets, they are very tightly structured. They also will mimic very tight meters. They'll have very specific patterns that they're supposed to follow. When you look at Shakespearean poetry, one of the things that he always did was iambic pentameter, which is 5 beats on a line. It's like da-da, 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 da-da. Unstressed, stress, da-da, da-da. You can hear this when you read out a Shakespeare poem. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. There are going to be some subtle variations, but for the most part, it's supposed to stick to that pattern. Why would you do that? What's the point of writing poetry like that? It's supposed to mimic a heartbeat, which is like, it's a love poem, let's make it sound like a heart. Yeah. Anyhow. American literature, because we started with the Puritans, and it's actually kind of interesting because we talked about poetry a little bit so far with Wigglesworth. Although I struggle to actually look at Wigglesworth as a poet because it's so wretched. But American poetry is typically a little more defined. It's coming in from a little bit more of a modern spectrum, in that we don't have all this history of British poetry where it was in kind of like its proto phase and it developed. American poetry, at least with its conception of the Western literary canon, jumps right on, and I really have to sneeze. I really don't want to lose this video. I'm sorry. You know what? I'm just going to keep going. So American poetry does not have to build off of the history of British poetry. It kind of just essentially jumps in, and it's American right from the very beginning. If you want to go into a World Lit course, you can track that development as it transitions from British to American. And in fact, one of the courses I've always wanted to teach for this college is British literature. That's kind of my specialty. I absolutely love British poetry. That's kind of one of the things I wrote my my thesis on. But American poetry is kind of a strange beast because we're starting right at something that's a little bit more modern. And I'm trying to use modern in the correct context here because modern does not necessarily mean stuff that is available now. It means that it's at the turn of the century. Normally, I think of modern around World War I and World War II. That's like the modernist era. And the stuff that came after is more postmodern. But in this case, what this means for poetry, the main people we're going to be focusing on in this fits our kind of weird historical trek. We're going to focus on Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman. This is such a cliche thing to do from a literature perspective, but in this case, I just simply have to be cliche because they're really cool to kind of cross-compare to one another. Dickinson is so simple in her language, but the images that she conjures are incredibly complex, so that you can argue about a Dickinson poem a great deal between two readers. Like, two people can get two completely different things out of a Dickinson poem. It's really cool, and unfortunately most students, they haven't been taught enough of the mechanics of poetry in order to pull this off. And again, not your fault, because poetry is really difficult to teach, and it's very divorced from your context. And this is a point I really want to make, because when we start tearing into these poets, there's going to be a lot of you out there, you're going to be holding on for dear life. You are not stupid, okay? These poems can be very intimidating, and they're very separate from how we write and how we read in the modern world. Poetry in a lot of ways is almost dead because it's so misunderstood and because people just kind of have a weird hackneyed conception of what it's supposed to be. So, as I'm teaching these poems, if you're just like, I've been listening to a video for 5 minutes, I don't know what the hell Mr. Bailey just said. Do not feel bad. This stuff is tough, man. It's really, really tough. I'm going to try to guide you through it, and I'm going to really try to tear apart Dickinson and Whitman so that you at least have an understanding of why they're famous and why people in why literary circles like them so much. That's tough. Again, don't feel bad if this goes right over your head. Now, back to the comparison. Dickinson's poems are very dense, but they're very simple. She does not use a lot of ornamentation in her language. Whitman comes in with these poems that are just absolutely gargantuan beasts that are busting off of the page, just swollen with description. And he's just showing off his experiences and his vocabulary. And he's like, I'm Walt Whitman. Look at all the words I know. Look at all the things I can write. I mean, Leaves of Grass is a gigantic single poem that we often study in sections just because nobody's going to read that whole thing unless you're really devoted to it. Now, a lot of what Whitman does is really cool, and I have a lot of respect for him, but that form of poetry is not my favorite. And it's going to be hard for me personally to go to Whitman because he's just not my guy, you know? I am very much enamored of Dickinson. Dickinson, man, I love Dickinson. Her technical prowess and the things that she does with language were just so ahead of her time that, like, she invented emo kids a century before there were emo kids, and that's really disrespectful to Miss Emily. But I don't know, like, I love poetry so much. But again, I just want to reiterate: don't freak out. It's tough. Stick with me. Take some notes so that when the test comes up, you'll be able to at least give me some halfway informed conversation about it. You'll be fine. And I'm going to try my best to try to make these people at least halfway interesting for you. Now, the poems that I like to cover for Dickinson, and that's what I want to focus on first. I heard a fly buzz when I died. Happy, huh? I felt a funeral in my brain. I love Dickinson. Because I could not stop for death. Dang, what's another good? We might do Wild Nights. I'll make sure these are all on the delicious reading list. I've been kind of assuming that you guys have access to that reading list. If I'm incorrect, just send me an email and tell me you can't find it. I'll be happy to, put the links on the announcements or something like that. Those are the main ones I want to talk about for Dickinson. I might come up with a few more. Don't freak out. Dickinson poems are short. But don't underestimate them. Read them a couple of times and really think about it. Think about what it reminds you of. Look up some words. Look up their definitions. It's easy. You don't even have to get out this big, massive dictionary to look them up. You can look them up. What does anti-disestablishmentarianism mean? Lick it up. I need to lay off the coffee. Go to Google and Google some words. It will help you when I actually start to talk about these poems. I'm going to read them to you because I'm narcissistic. Anyhow, let's have fun in internet land. Let's read some Dickinson.